Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThoughts, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games. And today we're going to be talking about Castlevania Lord of Shadows, a early 10s video game that was quite popular for maybe all the wrong reasons, being a reboot of the Castlevania franchise as a action hack and slash type game. And I'll be honest, even back then I was not a huge fan of this game, despite never having or still not having played any of the classic Castlevania games. I just remember that back then I never really got that far into the game because I just thought the combat didn't feel good, and I'll be honest, that's something that is not gonna change with this review. But I will say that I did end up coming out of this game with a more positive outlook than I entered expecting. So it's pretty obvious why this game exists or why it showed up at the time that it did. Obviously Konami wanted to, kind of cash in on the very big popularity of games like God of War and Devil May Cry, which had at that point released some of their most profitable games with God of War 3 and Devil May Cry 4, with even EA taking a crack at it with Dante's Inferno, which I'm not sure if it was well received or not, but it was a God of War-like game, but with a Christian background and made by Visceral. It was interesting, not particularly my favorite game. Regardless, Konami had to go at it as well with this Castlevania Lord of Shadows, because of course they needed to use an already established IP for this, because of course they had to, not really, but how money Konami. Regardless, let's get into it with the story. Obviously I don't have the context of other Castlevania games, so I'm not really gonna be comparing it too much to those, besides maybe referring that I recognize some things, like the main character is called Gabriel Belmont, and Belmont is a fairly important surname in Castlevania, but Gabriel himself is a new character, so to say. Or not, but that's saved for the sequel apparently, that I may or may not already be playing. But anyways, the story here doesn't really have much to it. They tried to add things with the Brotherhood of Light and the Earth making an alliance with the heavens. But it's really about a guy trying to recover his dead wife. I wonder what other game from this time did a similar plot. Next you're gonna tell me he gains the powers of the enemies he's trying to destroy. Yeah, he does. And well, it's really not a very compelling story, I'll be honest. I know some people like it. I know some people hate it for, what it means in Castlevania lore, maybe. I couldn't really speak to that. I'm very much in the middle of 2010 video game story where a guy has some really beaten over the head motivation to keep beating the other guys. What I really want to talk about then is the gameplay. To me, the interesting thing about it is how quickly I just immediately dropped it back when I originally played this game. To me, it felt too stiff and like the combat wasn't very satisfying even when you were hitting enemies. In a way that I can honestly say I've played action RPGs that have a better tactile feel, if that's something I can call it. To better explain this, what I'm talking about here is when you hit an enemy and he reacts to it. I feel like a lot of the times in this game it really feels like you're just hitting a health bar and the character really is just kind of doing its own thing. Meanwhile, when a character hits you, it's the complete opposite. It feels like you get completely locked up by them and you're kind of just sitting there waiting until you can get up again. Which I think are all attributes that make for a slower and, in my opinion, less satisfying gameplay compared to its contemporaries. And adding to this is also the progression system, which adds new things that don't really fix any of my problems with the gameplay in general. New moves are nice, but again, they're just more sluggish moves. And then we have also another addition that I don't even remember from when I first played this game, surprisingly enough, but coming back to it, it's the light and darkness, so to say, powers. With the light powers, focusing on a more defensive gameplay, and the dark powers on a more offensive by doing more damage, while the light has a tendency of protecting your life points more, and also some different changes when you use certain items, like for example a throwable grenade of sorts. Instead of working as a grenade, when you're using the light power, will work as a shield, which I do think is an interesting gameplay mechanic, but it doesn't really fix how sluggish it feels. And adding even more to this is the bosses. From my point of view, there are two types of bosses in this game. We have the fighting bosses. They play like every other boss in any video game, where you attack them and sometimes they attack back, and sometimes they attack back and you can't defend from it and you need to dodge it. And when they do that, they may also be creating an opening for you to attack them back. Rinse and repeat until you kill the boss, of course. The other type of boss, clearly also inspired by God of War in my opinion, is the giants. As the name says, these are giant enemies, and instead of fighting them really, you kind of parkour over them to get to their weak spot, to hit it over and over again until they die. It's not really a fight per se. It's somewhere in between God of War and Shadow of the Colossus. And honestly, that Shadow of the Colossus comparison is very generous for what this feels like. It is very much taking a very linear path with the parkour to this points, much like God of War once again. And the reason I'm bringing it up again is because honestly I'm wondering if I went back to playing God of War, the earlier ones, if I would actually not like them at all because of scenes like this. You know, what once felt like kind of cool, grandiose battles now really just feel like, oh, this is a parkour section where the wall moves. Maybe I'm just getting jaded, but this really just doesn't work for me anymore. I'm becoming a boomer. Shadow of the Colossus is good, God of War bad. I'm just kidding, even though technically true. Regardless, I've been pretty negative of the gameplay of this game so far, so what did make me come out of this with a positive outlook? And honestly, and I swear to God, it was the puzzles. Usually, I absolutely hate the puzzles in this type of game. They can feel like just a bit of a slow down to the pace, especially since most of the time they're the most brainless puzzles in all of existence. But here, while they're easy, I did find them oddly satisfying. They work in such a way that when you first look at them, you might not immediately understand how they work, but after trying it out for a little bit and understanding the mechanics, it becomes surprisingly enjoyable to do. For example, a puzzle that stood out to me was this makeshift chess game where the pieces had a life bar, which made it almost work like one of those tactic RPGs in a very simplified minigame way, and I enjoyed that. Another one had you shrunken down into a music box player and you had to play the music in a certain order to open the path in a certain order for you to progress, creating a situation where not only do you have to solve the puzzle, but also do some platforming in a timed manner, which I, again, found very interesting. It isn't the first time I've seen this, but still cool. And on that note as well, the other thing I enjoyed about this game was honestly its visuals. When I first played it, I honestly thought this game looked quite ugly. It does have a bit of a generic PS3 era color to it with that brownish and orange tones. But even with that, I still thought quite a lot of the places in this game looked quite cool. Like for example the castle that's controlled by the little girl and how she has the castle full of traps and puzzles and other machine-like monsters, creating for a really nice change of pace, because honestly until that point the enemy variety had not been particularly great, which is also another weak spot of this game. It's also kind of a shame that there isn't more of these cool locations, but also that the game really doesn't show you much of it early on. The first levels are like generic woods and swamp. It really does not put its best foot forward, which honestly makes me understand why I never really put too much time into it back then. But yeah, my stance on the graphics is it doesn't look great. It looks like a game of its time and it's not particularly aging gracefully, but it looks better than what I used to think about this game, with some creative locations at times, but not all the time, and I do think that does bring it down as well. Now, for the final thing, the soundtrack is okay. I think when you think about it individually, it is a good soundtrack. It sounds nice. For the whole thing, there's nothing that's like distractingly bad. But when you compare it to other Castlevania games and their soundtracks, it suddenly is a lot more noticeable, since those games do have quite iconic sounds to them. But once again, I'm really not looking at this review thinking of it as a Castlevania game, regardless of how much in the title it is that this is a Castlevania game, okay? And for those reasons, and more importantly the reasons that I gave before that, I am giving Castlevania Lords of Shadow a 6 out of 10. Maybe it helped that I went in with very low expectations, but I left this game feeling positive about it. Yeah, it's not great, but it's okay. There were no game-breaking bugs. The game played fine for all of it. You know, the frame rate was good. I really didn't have much to complain from a very technical standpoint. And as a game, it's just fine. If you took away the Castlevania title from it, I think people would probably enjoy it more than they do, or they would have a more positive outlook on it. Even if it still very much is a game that you can look at and say, wow, this came out in 2010. As for recommendations, I want to mention first that I played the Ultimate Edition, which comes with 2 DLCs, and I want to give my recommendation on that first. I think getting the Ultimate Edition, if it doesn't cost you any more money, I think you should go for it. Not because it's a better experience or anything, but because the first DLC is actually quite good. It focuses on that little girl I mentioned and her castle in a much more puzzle focused part of the game, which, like I said, I think it's the part of the game that works the best. The other DLC though is combat focus, as you know, I guess it makes sense. You have a puzzle focused DLC and then a combat focused one, and I'll just say that I didn't finish it and I really didn't care to. Regardless, recommendations wise, if you're a Castlevania fan, do I recommend this game? Not really. This is a late 2000s, early 10s action game that is very much stuck in that time. So honestly, my recommendation would be get this game if you're into games of that time. Maybe you enjoyed Dante's Inferno, God of War 3, games like that, and you want more of them, then yeah, give Castlevania Lords of Shadows a go. I don't think it's as good as those two games, but it is in the same vein, and I think it's fine enough, I guess. As long as you get it for a good price, of course, which shouldn't be too hard on a Steam sale or something like that. And as a PC port, it's really good, and it's the one I would honestly recommend, because with the PS3 or the Xbox 360 version, it is gonna look a lot more like a game of that era, which you might not mind, and that's fine. I usually don't mind it either if that's the only option. But of course, my opinion here is go for the PC version if you can. Regardless of any of that though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, even disliking now, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, what is a man but a miserable pile of secrets? Goodbye.